Hello, my name is Will Meshnig, and I'm a discussion group coordinator and member of the Student Advisory Board here at the Dole Institute. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. Discussion groups are made possible by Newman's Own Foundation, and we'd like to thank the Dolph Simons Family Fund for sponsoring Jerry's residency. Today's program will be live streamed and available on our YouTube channel. We are also excited that C-SPAN is going to broadcast this session. You can also access videos of past Dole Institute programming by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. For virtual viewers, please send your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. dolequestions@ku.edu. Please ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind and ask just one brief question again. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming our fall fellow, Jerry Sod.
Thank you, Will. Thank you all. So we did it. We had an election. It was an interesting night, possibly even more interesting morning after, I think, in some ways. And we're not done yet, obviously. But really interesting, really important results. We'll be chewing on those for a long time to come, but we're going to have a really good first take here today, I think. And happy to say that to do that, we have a real expert and a good friend. Jackie Calmes is with us. Jackie was a colleague for a long time at the Wall Street Journal for, I don't know what, 18 years? Then moved on, making a huge mistake, moved on to the New York Times, and now is a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, but has spent many years looking at politics, looking at congressional races in particular, and analyzing them. And
can I just interrupt to
yeah.
say, when I worked with you at the Wall Street Journal, readers would often write to me, far more than one, and say, why don't you go to the New York Times where you belong? So I did.
And so, you know, we'll try to walk through some of this. And then more importantly, I think toward the end, open it up so you can ask questions of me or of Jackie. I want to make one note at the outset here, though, which is that, you know, in many of the sessions that we have had here together during the course of this semester, my guests have been partisan figures, people who had partisan attachments and who were speaking as representatives of one party or the other by design. That way we saw both parties and heard both parties' views and pitches for this election and their analysis. That's not what we're about today. Jackie and I are going to look at the results as objective journalists with no axis to grind and try to give you unfiltered but objective analysis of what happened yesterday to the extent we know it. So with that in mind, let's dive in. So Jackie, we don't know yet which party is going to control Congress. We can perhaps look at a slide up there that gives you the current numbers. So the Senate is, at this point, a 48-48 tie. Those are the races that have actually been decided and called. And Republicans have an advantage in the House, but we don't know where either of these races is going to end up. What we do know, and Jackie, this is, I think, where we can start, is that this big red Republican wave that some people expected didn't quite materialize. The Republicans will probably end up with control of the House, may end up with control of the Senate, and that's not nothing. But something didn't quite happen that people were thinking was on its way. What do you think the reasons for that are?
Well, there are a number of them, and you're right. I mean, as Jerry says, I consider myself an objective journalist, but for over a year now, I have been a columnist, so I am a little freer than I used to be to express my opinions, and let me just stipulate that however critical I am of Republicans in the minutes to come, I want to say that I want nothing more for the Republican Party to become more healthy again, and for there to be a, healthy two-party system in this country. So I don't want anyone to think by what I'm saying that just because I'm a now left-of-center columnist that's where I'm coming from. And as they say, some of my best friends are Republicans. So to what you said, Jerry, I wrote a column this morning that may have posted by now, and I said, I mean, it's just astounding when you think about it that the Republicans have won back, well, are likely, it's not official yet, likely to win control of the House, and yet I consider them second only to Donald Trump himself as being the big losers of last night. And it's mainly because of expectations. They had done a lot themselves to build up expectations that they were going to have, you know, not just a red wave, but maybe a red tsunami. And as Ben Shapiro, the provocateur of the right wing, said, it was more like walking into a red wedding. And I think the reasons are, well, Trump, number one. I think, you know, usually a midterm election is a referendum on the president's party, which is why the president's party, well, on the president, which is why the president's party has lost in all but 3 elections since 1906. And yet Donald Trump, in his inimitable style, insisted it also be about him and injected, it was just ubiquitous, to the point where in recent days he teased that he was going to run for president and would have announced, apparently, or reportedly, but for advisors telling him not to. And the combination of Trump, his being so ubiquitous, the talk, his party's MAGA followers in Congress and in the states being, echoing his line, his election-denying line, and
I'll throw out one data point there from the exit polls last night. So 3/5 of the voters across the country last night said they had an unfavorable impression of Donald Trump, and 3/4 of those people ended up voting Democratic in their local House race.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the reality of it.
And so, you know, Republicans are cursing him privately today, and we just keep hearing that, but it's always still anonymous for the most part, except from the, you know, usual suspects like Congressman Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney. I think some of the other factors were their own sort of extremism. They sort of tamped it down towards the end in the final months, but in an issue that's been very big in Kansas, abortion, the Dobbs decision in June from the Supreme Court, reversing for the first time a constitutional right that had been recognized, was a gift to Democrats of a sort, but it did, you know, become less of an issue, we thought. But the fact is, for a while in the states, Republicans rushed to pass extreme laws, which just kept reminding people about what was at stake. And it was only recently, and then so when you saw in August, September, that Democrats were having a moment, cooler heads were prevailing and telling people to tamp it down. But as we saw, in a couple of ways, the exit polls, and Jerry would know the numbers, and I'm going not from an exit poll, but the AP does a survey of people who have voted, and the AP Votecast
Yeah.
showed that when voters were asked what were the issue that motivated them the most, the answer was different than what the pundits in some of the polls before election would have had led you to believe. The number one issue was inflation. We knew that was big, but it was 50%. But a close second, 44%, was the health of our democracy, the future of democracy. And people, if you remember, it was just days ago that people were making fun of Joe Biden or criticizing him for having given that speech about the importance of saving democracy when he should have been talking when voters only care about inflation. Well, it turns out they do care about. And most of those people voted for Democrats. And then third, 25% was abortion, which wasn't by any shot the highest, but it was still higher than you would have thought based on all the pre-election talk from the pundits that, you know, people really didn't, you know, they'd sort of forgotten about it. Time had passed that issue by.
So it's important probably to remember that Democrats, some problems for them were revealed last night too, and maybe we can start by looking at the Senate races, if we could get that chart up. And I think, yeah, so let's just look at a couple of these along the way. So they still could lose control of the Senate because of Arizona, because Mark Kelly has not won that race. They did lose a seat in Nevada, which has got to be a problem because Democrats had thought that was a state turning more blue. Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, who people thought was the most vulnerable incumbent Republican senator, looks like in fact, he has won.
Yeah.
And so, and if you step back from that, the other problem for Democrats that occurred to me was that, you know, we have always told ourselves in our little echo chamber in which you and I have resided for a long time that Florida and Ohio are kind of swing states. I think we
Right.
have to stop saying that
Yeah.
because they look redder than red after last night, particularly given what Ron DeSantis did in Florida and what J.D. Vance did to win the Senate race in Ohio. So some underlying weaknesses for Democrats emerge here as well.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking last night of all the election nights you and I spent together, and when it was all Ohio and Florida and back, and Ohio's my home state. And then now it's just, they're red. They're both, anybody who thinks otherwise is crazy. I think in Ohio, I mean, even though he lost by, what was it in the end, 6 points,
Six
Tim
points,
Ryan?
yeah, not that close, honestly.
Yeah, which I want to study. I want to look into that a little farther, find out why it was. But it just shows. I guess it just shows how red Ohio has become. But Tim Ryan was as good a candidate as Democrats could put up. And even though he lost, I would say that Democrats in a lot of places should take a lesson from him, from the campaign he ran, where he was like true to himself. And he really did emphasize really trying to get back Democrats linked to the working class voter, which might be too late in most places, but also to emphasize working with Republicans where possible. And he played up the, in addition, even though he gets credit for the economic and pro-working class argument that he was waging, he was also very much making a part of that the pro-democracy, and we need to protect our democracy as part of his message. Yeah. But again, he did lose. So
and just to sort of clarify the scorecard here on the Senate, so it looked as if Democrats have lost Nevada. They lost a seat there. Well, I mean, Axel is up by 3, so
Yeah.
still to be decided.
I just wasn't sure. I thought some of the votes that were outstanding were a lot of
Yeah, that's still open.
blue.
Fetterman has
Potentially.
won in Pennsylvania, so that's a Democratic pickup. So it could come down, and this is the point I was getting to Arizona and Georgia again.
Right.
And the possibility that the control of the Senate will be determined by a runoff next month in Georgia between
Again.
Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker seems like a very real possibility. And
Right.
who would have guessed we would do this again in Georgia?
I know. It's just, and it shows, I mean, it does show how very divided the country is, that for a second election in a row, we essentially come down to a 50-50 Senate. You know, and the Senate being more illustrative of the country as a whole because, you know, each state has the same number of votes. But this all gets to, I think one of the, I came away, for an election that didn't decide control of Congress, either house, it really was, we learned a lot, and it was a really sort of reassuring election that I thought it was a good one for democracy. So far, there were no major reports of trouble at the polls, let alone violence. I still have a residual fear that there's a lot of uncertain races that won't go Republicans' way, and I'm, including in Arizona, Carrie Lake, the governor's candidate.
Yeah.
And, Arizona's a state we've already seen great amount of volatility and threats. And so I'll be watching Donald Trump to see what he says about his candidates, election fraud. He's sort of already started at it, but to the extent, once these races are declared, and we'll see how the other side, whether they accept the verdict of the voters, and,
But it was not a great night for election deniers. People who deny that Joe Biden won the president. Well, let me go through a list here. The Mastriano, the governor's candidate in Pennsylvania, lost pretty easily. Tudor Nixon in Michigan, a Republican who was an election denier. Steve Chabot from your home state of Ohio, he lost. Possibly Carrie Lake in Arizona. So there will be an after action reporting here in which people will say, well, maybe denying that Joe Biden legitimately won the president in 2020 isn't such a great position to take.
Yeah, but I would say the big but on what you just said is that roughly, and again, these numbers are approximations because so many races haven't been called yet, but about 150 Republicans who won House seats last night, that includes incumbents and new members, are election deniers. And 80 election deniers did lose seats. So scores lost, but more scores won.
Let me, you raised the question of whether this is an election that showed some healthy things about our democracy. And let me pursue that a little bit more, because I think you're right. I think there are some encouraging things here, regardless of whether you're happy or unhappy with this race or that race or
Right.
its outcome. One of the things is ticket splitters reappeared. You know, we have this
Yes.
notion, which we've talked about here, that everybody's locked into a red silo or a blue silo. They put on their team's jersey and they vote for whoever's running for their team no matter what. That really wasn't so true yesterday. You had places where in significant races, people voted, say, for example, in a governor's race, Republican, in a Senate race, Democrat, and vice versa. You had ticket splitters that showed up in Wisconsin, where the Democratic governor will win re-election and the Republican senator may well win re-election. You had it in Ohio, where
Right.
the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, won easily and got far more votes than the Republican Senate candidate, J.D. Vance, which means some people moved back and forth between those two. And you saw it certainly in Georgia. Well, Raphael Warnock got way more votes in his race for the Senate than Stacey Abrams got in her race for
Right.
governor. So maybe voters are saying
and
this.
Governor Kemp got more than
Herschel
Walker.
Walker,
Oh,
yeah.
what's his name?
Yeah,
Herschel.
right. So maybe voters are telling us, and it might be worth putting up the governor's races here, because the chart with governor's races, because those were races where in some cases the candidate led the Senate candidate from their party, or there was a gap. Anyway, my point is, voters seem to have said, you know, we're actually thinking about this.
Yeah.
We're not locked in into our party's orders, and we're independent thinkers and we can make our own decisions. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, there was a little of that. I mean, it's sort of sobering. I hate to put, like, I keep tamping down your positive points, but that you had to have candidates so extreme before people would actually refuse to pull the lever for them. I'm showing my age. Nobody pulls the levers to vote anymore. But no, it was, and that, given the state of things right now, I'll take what little we can get. And we did get a little ticket splitting in this election, which is good. The number of people, there were a number of Republicans who did concede graciously.
And Tim Ryan, a Democrat,
Oh my
conceded
God, his was so good.
exceptionally gracefully, I thought.
I thought it was like second only to Al Gore's in 2000. I mean, it
Tim
was
Ryan, the Democrat
Tim
in
Ryan
Ohio.
in Ohio, yeah, his was a really nice. He said it. If any of you didn't see it, he said it was his privilege to have called J.D. Vance and conceded the election to him, because that's what we do in a democracy once the people have spoken. Sort of brought tears to my eyes, I have to say.
That was a good message. There's another message that it occurred to me that also came through yesterday, and this is relevant to Republicans, but it's probably something Democrats ought to heed as well, which is it doesn't hurt to have an actual governing agenda if you're going to run in what is essentially a national campaign. And I think we talked about this earlier when in a couple of these sessions, particularly when we had some pollsters here, Republicans really made an almost conscious decision not to really have a governing agenda that they're running on. Their calculation was that running against a relatively unpopular Democratic president and on the fact that inflation was scary to a lot of people, which it is, would be sufficient. I kind of think one of the lessons here is that that's really not enough. You agree?
Yeah, normally I might not agree because both parties do that, and it is especially in a midterm, in a presidential election you need a program, but in a midterm it's often been proven to be enough just to run against the president's party. But in this case, in part because it was so cynical, for instance, you had Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate, when asked earlier this year, and first of all, he was angry that the House had put out a plan, and thinly veiled angry, and he said, well, when he was asked about what the plan is, he says, I'll tell you, we'll have a plan, I'll tell you what it is after the election. And not for nothing is a biography of him entitled The Cynic, but and then he got angry when Senator Rick Scott of Florida put out a plan, but it was a bad plan, so I can understand why he was angry. But when you had issues that the Republicans were saying people really cared about, inflation, crime, and you're just talking about the problems and not offering any solutions, I think you leave yourself, bare.
And I wonder if Democrats aren't kicking themselves a little bit today by thinking if we had only had a better answer to the inflation question, that we had driven into the messaging machine a little more, maybe we wouldn't have lost control of the House, and maybe we would be clearly on our way back to controlling the Senate. And I think they also failed to come up with an answer to the number one concern that people had that might have actually, in the end, put them over the finish line.
Well, they sort of had an answer, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, except none of it was being felt or would be, or had even taken effect.
And I would argue wasn't explained particularly well either.
Right, it wasn't explained well. And on the other hand, I'm sort of like, what could they have done? They were just stuck with, the truth of the matter is, I think as you all know, is that members of Congress can't do much at all about inflation. And really, neither can a president for that matter. It's the Federal Reserve. They can make it worse, and some of the things that Republicans did say they were going to do would make it worse, like cutting spending too much but cutting taxes too deeply. Again, but that's not going to happen, neither one of those, when you have a Democratic president. So I don't know what more Democrats really could have said. They're stuck with that.
Well, inflation is, as we also have discussed here, inflation is an incumbent killer. That's just, it's terrible on the party in power, period. That always has been, and it always probably will be.
I mean, think about it. When you have high unemployment, you can have high unemployment and people are mad about it, but it doesn't affect everybody. High inflation affects all of us. There's not a person in this audience that's not affected. So it is the worst political problem to have, probably, other than, a sex scandal.
Yeah. I was just trying to think if
Maybe
you could put those two things together, but let's not think about that. Before we leave this point about voters showing us that they've got an independent streak and can think for themselves, we shouldn't walk past the results here in the state where we reside, in Kansas, where Laura Kelly, a Democrat, won re-election. At the same time that Chris Kobach, a Republican, a controversial Republican, appears to have won election as Attorney General, and where Sharice Davids, who was in a district that was made much tougher, at least seemingly so, by redistricting, a Democrat woman, a gay woman, won re-election fairly easily. So I think, and again, to return to a theme we've discussed here before, Kansas voters can make up their own minds. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, it is amazing. I don't know if I can't think of another election that offered something for everybody.
That's true.
Mean, like this one did. You were either up or down. But I am fascinated by what's happened in Kansas this year, not just in this election, but in the earlier vote on abortion. I mean, the whole nation was talking about that, obviously. But so I want to hear from you. How do you explain the yin and yang of Kansas politics?
I mean, there are a couple of factors I think that came into play. One was that I think Laura Kelly ran a really good, smart campaign. She portrayed herself as a middle-of-the-road candidate in a state that has shown that it kind of is comfortable with that kind of Democrat. And I think, again, I think probably Derek Schmidt, the Republican candidate, probably didn't have a clear enough program, and running against Laura Kelly was not sufficient. And I also think that there was some residual effect from what happened this summer with the abortion referendum, the constitutional a referendum on a constitutional amendment on abortion, or whether to remove the right to choice from the state constitution. you had a lot of women who were both activated as voters and registered as voters, and men too, to vote in that referendum, and they didn't go away between August and November. So I think you had a kind of a combination of forces. But I think it starts with having a good candidate, and I think Laura Kelly was a good candidate. And that's another lesson, I think, that you can draw more broadly across the country. It turns out candidate quality really does matter.
Yes,
you know, if Republicans
does.
had picked somebody other than Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, that was a winnable race, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, David.
Somebody who actually lived in Pennsylvania, for example, would have been a good thing to do.
Oh, my God. Crudités.
Yeah.
Yeah, David McCormick in Pennsylvania, he would have easily won, I think.
And he was the alternative to Dr. Oz
businessman who
on the
was
Republican side.
Narrowly beaten by Oz. Do you think Oprah's endorsement of Fetterman had much to had an impact?
You know, it didn't hurt, but I have a hard time believing that was a decisive factor, maybe because I don't want to believe that it was a decisive factor, but it did come late. But I also think, though, that one of the other things that emerged in Pennsylvania, but also elsewhere in the country, and I'm thinking about, for example, even in New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan won as a Democratic incumbent more easily than we thought, and where Senator Bennett in Colorado won as a Democratic incumbent more easily than we thought, is that I thought voters this year were way more willing than we're accustomed to in a midterm election to separate their views of the president from their vote in the midterm election. Because normally, you know, as we have probably written a zillion times, the deciding factor in most midterm elections is the popularity of the incumbent president. Well, voters seemed this time, for reasons I don't entirely understand, more willing than normal to separate their views on those two subjects. How I feel about the president and who I'm going to vote for in the midterm. Yeah,
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and I should have mentioned it. I should have mentioned it at the very outset, because I've rarely seen it, and never seen it to the extent we saw it in this midterms, where the polls showed that, and the results showed that voters had, in many cases, not held the Democratic candidate responsible for how much they disliked Joe Biden. And, you know, I can't really explain it, except, you know, again, candidate quality counts. People, you know, have to sell themselves. I don't know. You know, Biden kept a low profile, to say the least, but often presidents do in the midterms. I mean, Barack Obama didn't go out much in 2010, and Bill Clinton didn't go out much in '94, and George Bush certainly didn't in 2006, when all of them, their parties did badly. So I don't know. Why do you think the Democrats succeeded in separating themselves from Bush?
from Biden.
Biden. I do that all the time.
I don't know the answer to that question. I really don't. I think it's partly because there were a lot of candidates on the Democratic side who did a good job of separating their races in their states from the national picture, which is tough to do, but I think some of them did it well. And I also think that, to some extent, voters saw control of Congress as something that is important in its own right, and that was on a knife's edge here, and that made a difference. And what you really saw was Democrats who were unhappy with Joe Biden, willing to, you know, grit their teeth, bite their tongue, and vote for the Democrat. And maybe that's just partisans being partisan. I think it's probably a combination of all those things. Like,
you take an Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, who is a good member of Congress and a good candidate,
moderate
Democrat, who was very vulnerable, and wouldn't have surprised me in the least. In fact, I expected her to get defeated, and she didn't. And I mean, that is her establishing an identity for herself separate from Biden's. And so I think that you saw.
Well, in that sense, I think Democrats were forewarned that they needed to do that, and they did it. And the other thing that occurs to me as we have this conversation is that there was plenty of money on the Democratic side to help them do that. I mean, in most of these races, the Democratic candidate was as well funded, if not better funded, than the Republican candidate.
Well, you know, and speaking of Biden, think of he's headed to overseas for a series of summits on climate change, the typical November summits in Asia, and there's a third I'm forgetting. But
I think he's doing a couple of summits in Asia, which may include a visit
Yes.
with President Xi.
And so I just imagined him on Air Force One, just glumly, further absorbing the news of all the losses in his party for which he was being held responsible, and then going and meeting foreign leaders and being seen as a big loser and someone who, was arguably a lame duck, and that's not the case. It's instead of he's still a live, option for better and worse.
Well, let's go
to run for president. In
well, let's go
24.
there, because there are some consequences, obviously, going forward in any election, and this one's got some interesting ones. And let's start with the 2024 implications here on both sides.
Right,
So
right.
let me ask you whether you think that last night was as good a night as it seems to me for Ron DeSantis, the governor
Oh
of
my
Florida,
God.
as a potential alternate to Donald Trump in 2024.
Yeah, and so much so that as of the weekend, when Trump was at rallies calling him Ron DeSanctimonious, you knew that had gotten into Trump's head. I was ready, thinking, and you were hearing all the anonymous people from DeSantis' camp saying he's only 44, he can wait 4 years and still be young to run for president. And I subscribed to that. Here we are days later, and after he won by 20 points, 60-40 for re-election.
Against a credible Democratic candidate.
A former governor of
Former
Florida.
governor himself.
And he is just, one of the, if not the biggest, one of the biggest winners of the night. And suddenly people are saying, again, Tom Cotton took himself out of the race just days ago, because people were just thinking Trump's going to run. He's going to, he'll just run right over any of us. And now here you have, DeSantis has gone from, being, I assumed he was in the same basket with Tom Cotton, and now he's like, today, behind the scenes, you and I know that people are urging him to run. Last night at his rally, DeSantis' rally, the crowd was chanting 2 more years. It's a 4-year term for governor. But no, they want him to run in 2024, and they were openly chanting it. And he was, of course, smiling really big. But Trump is a real loser now. People, I think, see a chance. They see a chance for him to actually be taken out. The exit polls of Florida voters showing that by big margins, that Florida voters don't want Trump to run, and they, by big double digits, prefer DeSantis to Trump. Oh my God.
And one of the things that Ron DeSantis did in Florida was carry Dade County, which just doesn't happen, and tells you a lot about the breadth of his appeal in his home state, at least, and maybe beyond.
Yeah.
And I think the key factor here is one you just referred to, which is that regardless of what Ron DeSantis may be thinking today, the pressure on him from important quarters in the Republican Party to get in the race and run for president is now going to be huge. Because people who want an alternative to Donald Trump now see him as the horse to ride. And that's going to be hard pressure to resist, I would think.
And think about it, because Trump is a loser. It's a fact. Not only, so he won in 2016. Literally a loser. I'm not just, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. No, I wouldn't do that. He won in 2016, even though he lost the popular vote. But every cycle since then, he has lost. In 2018, which was another midterm that was indeed a referendum on the president's party, the president, his party lost both houses of Congress. And then in 2020, he lost. He indeed lost. And now we have 2022, where the Republicans didn't do at all as well as they thought they would. And he is, they would all tell you, a factor, if not the biggest factor.
So what do you think if let's assume Ron DeSantis decides, okay, I have to get into this thing. I have to, I want to, whatever it is. He gets in and gets in relatively soon next year. Does that open the door for another 10 Republicans
Yes.
to get in as well?
Don't you think?
I think, and then here's Donald Trump's secret weapon. If you take the anti-Trump vote in the Democratic Party, whatever you think that is, 40%, 60%, whatever it is, and divide it 10 ways, he wins with 30% of the party behind him, as he did in 2020.
Yeah.
So from his point of view, having Ron DeSantis come in and open the door for a whole bunch of other Republicans to come in and split the anti-Trump vote, that might be the secret sauce that he needs to win again, to win the nomination again, right?
Yeah, absolutely, just like he did in 2016.
And that's what I think could very well happen here.
Yeah, it would be interesting if Republicans, I don't know who the insiders would be who could pull this off, but if they could work behind the scenes to get behind just, well, ideally Ron DeSantis, but that won't happen.
You and I have seen this play attempted
Yes,
too
I
many
know,
times, and it
and
never works.
I don't think they can convince Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo. I
Chris
think
Christie.
Tom Cotton might be having second thoughts today from what, after just announced, Chris Christie. Even Larry Hogan is now seeing an opening, the retiring governor of Maryland, who's a bit moderate anti-Trump Republican. But we're looking at a potential bloodbath among the Republicans, aren't we?
Right.
I mean, especially when you have, Trump's not going to get out. He's not going to defer to anyone, and he's going to be, when he's cutting down what is the new star of the Republican Party, Ron DeSantis, already. I mean, and did you see what he said about not just the sanctimonious, but the comment about, I know a lot about him, and maybe more than his wife, and, if he gets in, I'm going to have to tell you about it. Oh my God,
Yeah.
who does that?
Yeah, right. So let's talk about on the Democratic side. The question of whether Joe Biden is really the best bet for Democrats, I don't think that's gone away because of what happened yesterday in any way. I mean, he is as old as he is. Democrats, you could argue, did reasonably well in spite of him, not because of him. He was, as you said before, nearly invisible in the key swing states. Does the pressure on Joe Biden from certain parts of the party to step aside and not run in 2024 continue? Does it increase? Does it decrease?
It's not clear that he's feeling much pressure, because those aren't the people he's hearing from, especially, and presidents, as you know, are very insulated people. So, and the difference is today, had things gone like most of us expected, with a tremendous night for Republicans, he would very much be, there would be overt pressure from the Democrats for him to start, thinking about stepping out of the, taking one for the party.
Right.
But
that's still going to be there.
It's still going to be there, but not to the extent it would have been.
Right.
And he, by all accounts, is inclined to run. I'm still not totally convinced of it, but
well, let me tell you in that context, what I think
Yeah.
was one of the sleeper races from last night that didn't get very much attention, but it is in Michigan, where Gretchen Whitmer, the incumbent Democratic governor, who faced a very serious threat from a very Trumpian Republican, won in the end reasonably comfortably. And if Joe Biden doesn't run and people are looking around for alternatives, I think people are going to look at that race in that state and her performance and say, well, maybe there's somebody who's a relatively moderate Democrat who can beat somebody who looks an awful lot like Trump.
Yeah. No, that goes to a point. I get a lot of argument about this, but I argue that the Democrats have a deeper bench than they get credit for. It's just that in the years from Obama to Biden and the way the Clintons, sucked all the oxygen out of the air for so long, that you don't know a lot of these people, and they're relatively recent. And having said that, you know, you'd think I'd have names off the top of my head, and I don't.
Well, I'll give you
Whitmer's a good
one,
one,
Governor Cooper from North Carolina. Doesn't get much attention.
Michael Bennet in Colorado, we already know that he wanted to be president, and he had quite a good race last night, even though he was thought to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. It's astounding to me that a governor of this just the 39 million population of the state, we haven't looked at California for a gubernatorial candidate seriously since Ronald Reagan.
Presidential candidate, you mean?
As a presidential candidate.
Yeah, no, exactly right.
But
So I want to talk a little bit about how this affects governing in Washington, which will be the subject of our conversation next week. But it's kind of hard to do now until we know. But I want to ask you a couple of questions before I turn it all over to you all for your questions. But let me start with this. So Democrats will probably still lose control of the House, though barely. Is this Nancy Pelosi's signal to say goodbye and move back to California?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, if you saw her interview with Anderson Cooper this week about her husband's, the bludgeoning of her husband, I mean, I came away thinking she's done, whatever the outcome, because she clearly, when he asked her what would would the election results affect her thinking, and she right away came back and said, what happened to my husband will affect my thinking. And you can hardly think that that's an argument for staying in. I think what's interesting to me is that you have this situation in the House, and we've seen this movie before. As I said, the Gingrich Republicans in the mid-'90s, the Tea Party Republicans in the mid-aughts, and now you have these Republicans that are going to take power, and it's going to be by a narrow enough margin. Well, even no matter what the margin was, likely speaker, although it's not assured, Kevin McCarthy of Bakersfield, California, is going to be, for all intents and purposes, I think, in nominal control. He's going to be essentially controlled by the MAGA wing of the party, like people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. And did Lauren Boebert lose, by the way?
Don't know yet. That hadn't been called yet as we walked in here.
And they are going to, like they have said, if you listen to House Republicans, what they were saying they were going to do with the majority, mostly they the word out of their mouth is Hunter. I mean, it's going to be Hunter Biden and then impeaching. Anyway, the movie we've seen is they overreach, they govern in an extreme way, and voters are repelled, and in the next election it works to Democrats' benefit. So it's sort of, there was more than one Democrat out there that was actually hoping for the House to go.
And then final thought, you know, if power is divided in Washington, as it probably will be, whether Republicans have control of one House of Congress or both, and Joe Biden is obviously still president, there are going to be people who say that's a disaster for the president. He can't get anything done. I'm not sure I buy that, because I think divided government is probably, that's where Joe Biden may be able to work best.
Right.
Find common ground with a few Republicans and tell the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, sorry, I can't do everything you want. I got to deal with these guys over here. Agree?
I agree with you. Totally agree with you. And if he is going to keep the Senate, the importance of keeping the Senate for the Democrats is that he continues to get his judicial candidates confirmed. If the Senate goes Republican, we'll be looking at the 2 years that look just like the last 2 years of the Obama administration, where Mitch McConnell keeps a virtual blockade on judicial nominees. And as for, you know, it's the good news for Democrats is they achieved so much of their agenda in these past 2 years that now, you know, they should just spend the time implementing those things and making sure they work. You know, there's not a lot more they need to do. They've voting rights. We need the election, what is it, election control, not election, ECA. I always,
the Election Control Act?
That I know.
It's the one that never got anywhere.
It'll come to me.
And let me throw one more on the list.
Because we need that before 2024.
But let me put one more on the list, which is that I think in that environment, Joe Biden on the one hand and Mitch McConnell on the other are able to keep aid flowing to Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Because in a closely divided House, there's not enough MAGA, America First sentiment to really mount an effort to cut off aid to Ukraine, which some would like to do.
Yes.
So I think that's important also.
Yeah.
Well, let me open it up to you all for questions. A couple of procedural things. We have 2 mics. Heidi and Will have them. Raise your hand and I'll call on you. Stand up so we can all see and hear you better. And we'll start right here, and then Catherine, you next. Oh, no, okay, there. And just a reminder, a question is a question. As I like to say, it has a question mark at the end of the sentence. So have at it.
Good. So I think we've seen...
I think that's not on.
It just projects or...
No, wait a second. We'll do a redo here. Will's coming up for a mic. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think one of the more interesting things that we saw last night was Ron DeSantis. And I think I remember some parallels with what we saw there, looking back also to Glenn Youngkin, who was also somebody who tried to avoid the whole topic of Trump and sort of run as somebody who was moderate. And with those being 2 of the bigger success stories for the Republican Party recently, do you think that sets a path forward back to a very respectable, moderate Republican Party in the future?
Well, I mean, I would say that they sort of represent, Youngkin and DeSantis, 2 different paths for a post-Trump party with DeSantis. I mean, they're both, Youngkin is more like Trump than he wants to admit, or more like, well, Trumpism. But DeSantis is, you know, there's very little on which he and Trump disagree on policy and in terms of style. In fact, DeSantis is even, he goes beyond Trump in some ways when you think of this things like grabbing some undocumented immigrants in Texas and putting them on a plane to Martha's Vineyard. I mean, Trump had never thought of that. And, you know, and then taking these, right 2 months before the election, going out with your election fraud unit, clearly embarrassed to be arresting these voters, former felons who thought who had been encouraged to register to vote, and now they're being taken to jail. I mean, so I guess there's, Youngkin is more moderate and mostly tries to look moderate, whereas DeSantis is in your face. So
I would just add that I'm glad you raised Glenn Youngkin, because in the panoply of Republicans who will now be under some pressure from within the party to think about running in 2024, even though he's only been governor for a year, he will be. And you know, he strikes me as the kind of guy who's probably susceptible to that kind of pressure, to be totally honest. Because there is a search underway, I think you'll agree, Jackie, in certain parts of the Republican Party to find the mainstream Bob Dole-like traditional conservative who isn't weighted down with a lot of Trump baggage. And I think at this point, Glenn Youngkin still qualifies as that. So yeah, it's a good name to throw out there. Go ahead, Catherine, and then we'll come back there next.
Hello. In 2020, there was discussion about voting as, you know, maybe not realistic, or the idea that if the election was stolen, that we couldn't trust our elections and people might not want to get out and vote. Do you think that any of that rhetoric applied in this cycle, now that there's been a lot of time for Republicans to kind of promote stolen election rhetoric?
You should answer, but I'll give you a quick answer. I saw no sign that anybody stayed away because they were told their vote wouldn't count. I think probably the opposite, that it probably incentivized some people to vote, and I'll show them. But it's an interesting question. It's hard to prove a negative, right? I mean, you can't prove that somebody didn't show up for a reason. But I don't get that sense. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I do agree. I think among Democratic voters and Democratic-leaning voters, and I'm thinking particularly of the black community, that there was almost a resolve to vote because they wanted to show that these laws that had been passed were not going to inhibit them, the laws that had been passed in the states that were restrictive of voting. But more, I guess the greater threat to people not coming out to vote was on Republicans' own side. And I'm with Jerry, I don't really see this time that it had an impact. I think they were hearing so much about it was going to be a good year for Republicans that they wanted to be part of it.
You know, I just add one footnote there because it's a little off subject, but I meant to mention it earlier. One of the things that happened beneath the surface here was there are some signs that Republicans continue to chip away at Democratic dominance with Latino voters and with black men. So that wasn't enough to tip the balance in some cases, but I think Democrats need to continue to watch that space.
Democrats have really, you know, it's almost too late for Democrats to arrest their erosion of support in the Latino community. But there was evidence, I mean, in the 3 races in the Texas, Rio Grande Valley that people were watching, where there was, in the days before the election, Republicans were confident of taking all 3 congressional races that were battlegrounds. Democrats kept 2 of the 3. And so that was, the Democrats are very happy about that today, but offsetting that was the huge loss of Miami-Dade County, which used to be a Democratic stronghold. But you know, all of this points up, as does the fact that Democrats have a problem with Latinos to begin with, the fact that Latinos are not a monolith and never have been. And in a place like Texas, I lived in Texas for 6 years and covered state government and politics there at the start of my career. You have, you know, Latinos run from people who are 6th, 7th generation, people who were Texans before it was Texas. And they have been there their whole lives, and a lot of them were receptive of Trump's building a wall. Yeah. So it runs the gamut, you know, and we aren't even talking about Venezuelans and Cubans and all their individual interests.
We'll go there and then.
Hi. My question is that we seem to be entering a new era where more and more voting happens before Election Day. I can't remember where, but I heard that many people had voted for Fetterman in October before the debate had even happened. How do you think that changes political strategy, and how do you think that should change political coverage of these races?
Well, the most immediate way it affects my coverage is that I rarely write Election Day anymore. I either refer somehow to the season or
you mean the term election day?
The term election day, because you know it's a multi-day, multi-week process. And you're right. I mean, when I saw the date for the Pennsylvania Senate debate, I thought, wow, that is, you know, so many people will have voted by then, which was probably good for Fetterman.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that but you know, there's a good example. As an aside, that debate, you know, again, this is one where I think the punditry gets, you know, into this echo chamber where it was all about, all the reporting focused on Fetterman and how he, you know, his debility or the clear signs of this was a man who had had a stroke. And I think, and I thought as I watched it, that he would get credit from some people for resilience, for just being willing to debate. And you know, what was lost in the attention to Fetterman is what Oz said about abortion and how local political officials should be in on the decision. And it's like, you know, I think the voters were attuned to that. But to your point, to your question, I think the coverage has to be very cognizant of, you know, not getting at the end, of factors that come into play at the end, not thinking those are necessarily so as pivotal as we would have in the past, because so many people would have already voted. And frankly, I'm a big fan of early voting, and the idea that Trump is telling people to vote on only that one day is crazy. Especially, you see in Nevada, there were huge snowstorms that that blew in, and I have to wonder. I mean, if Laxalt indeed wins and the Republican governor wins, I guess it'll be but certainly some people stayed home once they were hit by the storm.
Yeah.
So that's the risk you run.
I think there's going to be an effort to reduce the window for early voting precisely because of that. That's my gut feeling.
Yeah. And there have been in Republican
Right.
states.
Right. Right back there, and then up here next. Okay.
This is perfect because I actually have a two-finger on the last question. So the previous gentleman talked about voting that's happening earlier, and I wanted to ask you guys about your opinions on counting that's happening later. So as two people who've worked extensively in news media, obviously, in past elections, we found out what happened on election night. But in the last several cycles, it's been a several-day or a week-long process. How will that change your approach as media figures? How should it change the approach of people who are reporting on election night? And how can we combat narratives of people who attempt to claim interference when voting is just taking longer than it used to?
I think the media, especially this year, at least I'm thinking a lot about cable news, but it was also true in the print media, we're doing a really good job. And I subscribe to a number of regional papers, websites, so I'm not just thinking about the Washington Post and New York Times. Really, we're alerting people ahead of time to don't expect the results on election night, which is a good thing. I mean, it's not like we used to be when most people, well, for much of my life, you did vote on election day only. And you have a situation where there's so many different, kinds of voting, and then the military vote comes in, but that always came in late and in a close race would make a difference. But you have a little cynical game going on too, as the Republicans have talked about, Donald Trump chiefly, about how you shouldn't count votes after the election day. Well, you take Pennsylvania, it's a state where it's controlled by Republicans, and they've passed a law that bans the election administrators from counting early votes, mail-in votes, until election day. So that's, then why you have this situation where the votes coming in on election day show up first and they favor Republicans, and then the later votes favor Democrats, and then Donald Trump claims it's a fraud.
I think this is a problem that's going to have to get addressed and resolved, because I think it makes people confused, and it may actually be insane to have state laws that say that you cannot open an envelope for a mail-in ballot that you got 2 weeks before election day until the day after the election.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense, and those laws are anachronisms. And I think there's going to be a bipartisan effort to clean up that process, because I don't think it's healthy for anybody. Not easy for people in our business, but that's the least of the issues. I think it's confusing for voters and gives rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories that none of us ought to want to see perpetuated.
I agree with you, but the problem is our system of voting, as we've learned the hard way repeatedly, is a decentralized, and it's the state's control and the counties, and it gets down to the county level where they have their own rules. And whereas after the 2000 recount, there was a bipartisan push to try to sort out some of these problems that were inherent in federalism and decentralization. And you had in 2003, 2004, the first major federal election law that was, with the honey of federal funds to the states, it was encouraging a uniformity that hadn't existed before.
Right.
But those were different times. We thought it was partisan then. Now I'm not sure that Republicans would feel that they could come to the table.
It may be, but I mean, if there were a set of best practices, at least, that were suggested to the states as a way to get around the problem that you correctly cite, I don't know, maybe.
I absolutely think it should be what's done.
Yeah. There was another question here.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering if there are any implications that we can take away from the race on like the moderate and progressive split in the Democratic Party, and kind of what that dynamic's going to look like going forward.
Good question.
That's a really good question. I think what we've seen in the first 2 years of the Biden administration is that he felt under a great deal of pressure from the progressive wing, and he governed accordingly. for better and worse. And but as they sort of hit some defeats, and things like the original, the original attempt at what became the Inflation Reduction Act was a $3.5 trillion multi-year package. Bernie Sanders would have had it be $6 trillion. And now the Democrats have been on the defensive because it came down to $1.9 trillion, and Republicans were successfully depicting it as an inflation stoker. But I think what happened by the end of this past 2 years is that the progressives had, from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez across the board, had realized or were pragmatic about the fact that it was clear that a lot of their wish list couldn't get through because in a 50-50 Senate, you can't do it, So I think there was a pragmatism that has set in, an accommodation with that, and I think that will still be there in Congress, certainly now that Republicans are going to run the House. That said, as their vision turns to the 2024 presidential nomination race, and whether anybody will challenge Joe Biden or what Joe Biden's program should be, I think the progressives are going to start
I agree with
becoming more assertive.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that the split was pretty well contained in this election. I think the problem begins going forward when, as I said, if Joe Biden decides to do what Bill Clinton did after he lost control of the House in 1994 and tack to the center, he's going to get a lot of grief on his left as he does that. And that's what I think is the most likely outcome. So I think stay tuned on that.
What would you like to, can I ask, what would you like to happen? Do you have an opinion on that?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know. I tend to lean a bit more progressive, but what I wanted to hear your take on how I don't know.
You're in good company. I think we have one online question. Heidi?
Yes, we have an online question from Michael Matson. Seeing the first Gen Z member win a Senate seat in Congress last night in Florida, how do you think the younger vote influenced the elections last night, and are they influencing elections differently from the older generation?
That's a good question.
Yeah, too soon to tell. I've seen generational changes in Congress, so it definitely has an impact. I remember at the Wall Street Journal writing a story after the 1990 elections that the first non-baby boomer, the first, wasn't a non-baby boomer, it was the first person, first child of the 60s, as I put it, the first member of Congress who couldn't remember what he or she was doing on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, which sounds like ancient history now. But it brought a more conservative, both in the Republican and the Democratic side, brought a more conservative point of view than there had been. And up until that point, it was more of a combination of post-war, New Deal Democrats, and more moderate Republicans.
It's a fascinating question. I don't think we know. I have a theory that there's a stereotype view of Gen Z voters that they're all way liberal and that's they're in lockstep. I think it's different. I find the research indicates they're more independent-minded, they're less tied to partisan identity. They may be ideological, but they're not partisan, and that they seem more pragmatic than I think they're given credit for. And that's what I think you'll get out of that. Heidi's nodding her head. So, okay, that makes me feel better. Thank you. If there's one last question, we can do one.
There was a question over here.
Yeah, sorry, we actually have time for just one more, and I'll do it in the front row here. And then we're going to have to wrap up.
So with the, you were talking about the decentralization of the election, like how elections are counted in states and all that. Do you see any concern with the topic of election fraud still being very prevalent in a lot of people's minds and a lot of voters' minds? Do you see there being any concern in the actual election process with people being put into these positions where they can challenge ballots based on whether they think this is fraudulent or not? And do you see any concern in that affecting the results in any way?
You go first, and I'll close off with a thought
Okay.
on this. 'Cause I think it's a really good question.
No,
also.
I'm very concerned, and like I had said earlier, that we didn't see much controversy yet, but as these races get settled and then they have to be certified, it will be interesting to see. Now, there have been court cases since in the past year. For instance, in New Mexico, there was a, I think the man was a I can't remember if he was a Proud Boy or an Oath Keeper, but you know the type. And he was a member of their county commission and refused to certify an election, and the courts forced him to. So there are precedent now. But I think it's a real question, because the Republicans have done an incredible job over the past 18 months, 20 months of getting people in at the local level. Steve Bannon calls it the precinct strategy, and he's been pushing it ever since, basically since the wake of January 6th. And so, but I think the biggest concern I would have for it is when the next presidential election.
I'll close out with a slightly more optimistic view, because guess I'm the optimist in the room right now.
I had some optimism.
Yeah, I know. I kind of think it's possible, and I'm not predicting this, I'm just saying it's possible that this election might have marked the high water mark of the kind of election fraud, election denial, it's all been rigged movement. Because you saw a lot of, as Jackie said earlier, you saw a lot of candidates who could have cried foul and said it was stolen from me, not do that in the last 12 to 14 hours. And maybe a lot more voters are saying with the way they voted that enough of this. I can't point to absolute proof of that. My gut maybe tells me that could be the case. But Jackie's also right. The testing ground of that is not this year. The testing ground for that is 2024. So I think we have to stop there, because we could go on, but we'll go on next week. But for now, join me in thanking Jackie for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. We'll do this again one last time next week when our friend John Harwood will be here, and along with Lindsay Wise, who covered politics for years for the Kansas City Star and now is part of the Wall Street Journal's congressional reporting team. And a lot of the dust that we're talking about today will have settled by then, and we'll have a serious look at how the results change the way Washington works. So I hope you can all join us then. I look forward to seeing you, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you.